I used to think the quietest sound in a neighborhood was early morning birds. Turns out it's the moment right after a tow truck hooks up a luxury SUV and an entire HOA realizes something has gone very, very wrong. The metal clink of the chain echoed across the cul-de-sac at exactly 7:18 a.m., sharp and final, like a judge's gavel. Linda Whitmore's white Mercedes GLS, her pride, her rolling symbol of neighborhood authority, was slowly lifting off the pavement in front of half the subdivision. And the best part? This time, there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. But to understand how a perfectly normal driveway turned into the most expensive lesson an HOA Karen ever learned, you have to go back about 3 months. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 38 years old, born and raised in this town, and I run a small auto repair garage out of the detached shop behind my house. Nothing fancy, just honest work, oil changes, brake jobs, engine rebuilds if someone's willing to wait a couple weeks. My driveway isn't just where I park my truck. It's the only access point wide enough to get customer vehicles in and out of the garage. 12 feet across, 60 feet long, straight shot to the street. Simple, functional, until Linda Whitmore decided it belonged to her. The first time it happened, I figured it was an accident. I stepped outside one Tuesday morning with my coffee still steaming in my hand, gravel crunching under my boots, and there it was, a white Mercedes parked sideways across the mouth of my driveway like it owned the place. Sun bouncing off the chrome trim, engine still ticking from the heat. I stood there for a second, thinking maybe she'd just pulled over to answer a call. Then Linda stepped out of the driver's seat wearing one of those bright tennis outfits she liked to parade around the neighborhood in. "Morning, Ethan," she said, smiling like we were sharing a pleasant little moment. I pointed at the car. "Linda, you're blocking my driveway." She glanced back at it, shrugged like it was nothing. "Oh, it'll just be a minute. I'm heading to the clubhouse meeting." A minute turned into 25. By the time she finally moved it, I'd already had to call a customer and push his appointment back an hour. Annoying, but not the end of the world. Except it kept happening. Next week. Then 2 days later. Then again on a Saturday morning when I had 3 trucks scheduled for brake work. Same car. Same spot. Same casual shrug like it was perfectly normal to block the only access to someone's livelihood. By the 4th time I tried being polite. By the 10th time I tried being firm. By the 20th time I started realizing something about Linda Whitmore. She wasn't forgetting. She was testing how far she could push. Because in Linda's mind, she didn't just live in this neighborhood. She ruled it. Linda Whitmore wasn't technically the HOA president. That title belonged to some retired dentist who barely showed up to meetings. But everyone knew who actually ran things around here. Linda sat on the board, sold real estate in the area, and had the kind of voice that could cut through a room full of people like a leaf blower at 6 in the morning. If she didn't like something, suddenly it became a community concern. And apparently, my little garage was the latest problem. Industrial activity. She called it one afternoon, while leaning against her Mercedes like it was a throne. It's not really in line with the neighborhood aesthetic. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and looked at her over the hood of a pickup I was working on. "Linda, this property's zoned residential with home business allowance. City signed off on it years ago." Her smile tightened. "Well, we'll see about that." What she started doing instead was simpler, petty, and a lot more disruptive. She just parked her car across my driveway whenever she felt like it. Morning meetings. HOA walks. Sometimes just sitting there scrolling her phone like the street was her personal waiting room. The crunch of tires on gravel became a sound that instantly made my jaw tighten because 9 times out of 10, it meant that white Mercedes was about to settle right into the exact spot that kept me from doing my job. 27 times in 2 months. Yeah, I counted. And eventually I realized something important about bullies like Linda Whitmore. They always assume the other guy will keep playing nice forever. What she didn't know was that I had finally stopped playing nice. And the morning those tow trucks rolled into our quiet little cul-de-sac, the entire neighborhood was about to learn exactly what happens when someone mistakes patience for weakness. Most people think a driveway is just a strip of concrete leading to a garage. For me, it was the lifeline of my entire business. Every morning started the same way. The smell of motor oil lingering in the air, a thermos of black coffee sitting on the workbench, and the low hum of a compressor kicking on inside my garage. I have been fixing cars since I was 17 years old, the kind of work where your hands are always a little rough and your clothes never stay clean for long. After 20 years turning wrenches for other shops, I finally saved enough to buy this small house and build the detached garage behind it. Nothing glamorous. 2 service bays, a lift, a wall of tools I collected piece by piece, and a gravel driveway wide enough to bring in pickup trucks and work vans. Most of my customers were regular people from around town. Teachers, electricians, delivery drivers, the kind of folks who depend on their vehicles every single day. When their cars break down, they do not want a dealership charging them $2,000 for something that should cost $300. They come to me because I fix things honestly and I explained every bolt I touch. That driveway made the entire operation possible. Customers would pull in, I would guide them into the shop, and by the afternoon they would drive out with an engine that sounded healthy again. Simple system. Until Linda Whitmore decided it was her personal parking space. The thing about Linda is that she moved through the neighborhood like she was the mayor of a very small country. Perfect blonde hair that never seemed to move even when the wind picked up, sunglasses bigger than necessary, and that white Mercedes sport utility vehicle that always looked freshly detailed. She sold houses around the county and loved to remind people that property values were her specialty. According to Linda, every decision in the neighborhood had to protect those values. The color of a mailbox, the height of a hedge, the exact shade of paint on a garage door. She carried the HOA rulebook like it was a sacred document. And somewhere along the way she decided my garage was the one thing that did not belong. It started with small comments. Whenever she walked past, I would be under the hood of a truck and hear her voice drifting across the yard. She would say things like, "That noise travels quite a bit," or "Clients might prefer a quieter street." I usually just nodded and kept working. The city had already approved my home business permit years earlier. Everything I did was legal, inspected, and insured. But Linda did not care about the paperwork. She cared about control. And control in her mind meant deciding how everyone else lived. After a few weeks of those little comments, the driveway problem started showing up more often. Sometimes she would park halfway across it while taking phone calls. Sometimes she would leave the Mercedes there while she walked to the clubhouse 2 streets over. Once she even told a neighbor she needed the spot because the street parking felt too crowded. Each time I would walk outside and see that white vehicle sitting sideways across the gravel like a barrier gate. The sunlight bouncing off the windshield made it look almost deliberate, like the car itself was staring back at me. The worst part was not the inconvenience. It was the timing. The blocking always happened right when customers were scheduled to arrive. I would hear an engine coming down the street, see a pickup truck turning the corner, and then watch the driver slow down because there was no way into my driveway. More than once I had to jog down the street waving my hands just to explain that the shop was open and the blockage was temporary. The embarrassment sat in my chest heavier than the tools in my pockets. A business depends on trust. If people think getting to your shop is complicated, they simply go somewhere else. And Linda Whitmore, whether she admitted it or not, seemed perfectly comfortable letting that happen. By the time the driveway had been blocked for the 15th time, the entire routine of my mornings had started to change. Instead of walking into the garage thinking about brake pads or oil filters, I stepped outside first and scanned the street like a man checking the weather. The air usually smelled like damp grass and cold pavement that early, and sometimes there was the faint scent of gasoline drifting from the road. And almost every time my eyes would land on the same thing. That white Mercedes sitting across my driveway like it had been placed there on purpose. I tried to handle it the reasonable way at first. One afternoon when Linda was standing in her yard trimming a rose bush that looked like it belonged in a magazine, I walked over and spoke as calmly as I could. I explained that my customers needed clear access to the garage. I explained that even a short delay could cause people to cancel appointments. She listened with that polite smile people use when they are already planning to ignore everything you say. Then she gave a small nod and said she understood. The next morning her car was parked in the exact same spot again. That was when I realized something important about Linda Whitmore. She did not see my request as a problem that needed solving. She saw it as a challenge to her authority. The pattern became obvious after that. Whenever I had a full day of scheduled work, her vehicle would appear like clockwork. Sometimes she would leave it there for 10 minutes, sometimes 40. One time it stayed for nearly an hour while she chatted with another neighbor at the corner like they were enjoying a quiet afternoon. Meanwhile, I stood there with a customer waiting behind their pickup truck, both of us staring at a driveway that had become completely useless. The embarrassment built slowly but steadily. Word spreads quickly in neighborhoods like ours. A few customers started asking whether parking was always difficult. One man who ran a landscaping company even joked that he might need a tow truck just to bring his trailer in for repairs. He laughed when he said it, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. And doubt is the kind of thing a small business cannot afford. Around the same time, Linda's comments about the garage became more direct. One evening while I was closing the shop doors, she walked past with two other residents from the HOA board. I heard her voice floating across the yard like she wanted me to hear every word. She told them the neighborhood had certain standards and that commercial-looking activity might require review. The phrase hung in the air longer than it should have. Commercial-looking activity. As if repairing someone's truck was some kind of contamination. The next week a letter appeared in my mailbox with the HOA logo printed neatly at the top. The paper smelled faintly like fresh ink when I unfolded it on the kitchen table. According to the notice, several residents had raised concerns about increased traffic and parking disruptions near my property. Reading those words felt like someone quietly rewriting reality. The only parking disruption on that street was the same white Mercedes that kept blocking my driveway. Yet somehow the complaint had been turned around like a mirror reflecting blame in the wrong direction. I sat there for a long moment staring at the letter while the refrigerator hummed behind me and the evening sun stretched across the floor. That was when the situation stopped feeling like a simple annoyance and started looking a lot more like strategy. Because Linda Whitmore was not just parking her car in the wrong place. She was building a story where my garage was the problem and her actions were the solution. And the more I watched that pattern unfold, the more certain I became that patience alone was not going to fix it. The letter from the Homeowners Association sat on my kitchen table for 2 days before I decided to attend the next neighborhood meeting. I do not usually involve myself in those gatherings because most of them revolve around mailbox colors and lawn heights. But this situation had already crossed into something that could damage my livelihood. Tuesday evening, the sun was sliding down behind the houses when I walked to the clubhouse at the end of the street. The building smelled faintly like cleaning chemicals and fresh carpet, the kind of place where every chair lines up in perfect rows and people speak in careful, polite tones even when they disagree. About 15 residents were already seated, sipping coffee from paper cups and talking quietly. At the front of the room sat the long folding table where the board members usually gathered. Linda Whitmore was already there, her white folder neatly stacked in front of her like she was preparing to present evidence in court. When the meeting started, the president read through the usual agenda items. Landscaping budgets, holiday decorations, speed limit reminders. Then Linda cleared her throat and slid a sheet of paper across the table like someone placing a card on a poker table. Her voice carried across the room with the same confidence I had heard outside my garage many times. She explained that several neighbors had expressed concern about increased vehicle traffic around my property. She said the driveway area sometimes caused congestion and that certain residents had difficulty navigating the street when vehicles entered and exited the garage. I sat there listening as if I had stepped into an alternate version of reality. The only obstruction anyone had experienced was the same Mercedes that kept parking across my driveway. But somehow the conversation had been flipped so the garage itself looked like the disruption. A few neighbors glanced back at me with uncertain expressions, as if they were trying to understand both sides of a story that had only been told one way. When the president asked whether anyone wanted to comment, I raised my hand. The folding chair creaked slightly when I stood up, and the room went quiet. I explained calmly that my business was fully permitted by the city and that the driveway had been part of the property long before most of the houses in the subdivision were built. I also mentioned, as carefully as possible, that several of the access problems people were describing happened because vehicles occasionally blocked the entrance to that driveway. I did not say Linda's name directly, but everyone in that room knew exactly what I meant. Linda's smile never moved while I spoke. She simply folded her hands on the table and waited for me to finish. Then she leaned forward slightly and said that community rules required everyone to cooperate with neighborhood standards. Her tone was smooth and measured, like someone explaining a policy that had already been decided. According to her, the board would need to review whether home businesses like mine were creating unnecessary traffic patterns. The phrase unnecessary traffic patterns hung in the air like a carefully placed accusation. A few minutes later, the meeting moved on to other topics, but the message had already been delivered. Walking back to my house that night, the streetlights casting long yellow reflections across the pavement, I realized something that had not been obvious before. Linda was not simply irritating me out of habit or convenience. She was setting the stage for a complaint that would eventually force the garage to close. And if that happened, the driveway she kept blocking would no longer matter at all. The morning after that HOA meeting, the air felt heavier than usual, like the neighborhood itself had shifted slightly out of alignment. I unlocked the side door to my garage just after sunrise, the familiar smell of rubber and motor oil settling around me like a routine I could depend on. The compressor kicked on with its steady hum, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. A red Ford pickup was scheduled for a brake replacement at 8 o'clock, followed by a delivery van that needed a new alternator. Honest work. Predictable work. The kind of work that kept my bills paid and my hands busy. At 7:45, I heard tires rolling slowly over gravel outside. That sound had become impossible to ignore over the past few weeks. I stepped out of the garage, wiping my hands on a rag, and there it was again. The white Mercedes, parked sideways across the entrance of my driveway like someone had dropped a barricade in the middle of the street. The engine was still running, and Linda Whitmore sat behind the wheel talking into her phone, with one hand resting casually on the steering wheel. She looked up, saw me standing there, and gave a small wave like we were neighbors sharing a friendly morning greeting. I walked down the driveway until I was close enough for her to hear me through the open window. I told her calmly that I had customers arriving in a few minutes, and I needed the driveway clear. She glanced at the empty street, then back at me, and said she was almost finished with her call. That phrase had become one of her favorites. Almost finished. The problem was that her definition of almost never matched reality. 10 minutes later, the Ford pickup pulled around the corner exactly on schedule. The driver slowed down, then stopped halfway in the street when he realized there was no way to enter the driveway. I walked out to meet him, apologizing while gesturing toward the Mercedes that still had not moved. He nodded politely, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. From his perspective, it probably looked like my driveway was permanently blocked by a resident who did not care. Eventually, Linda ended her call and drove off with the same relaxed expression she always wore. The pickup finally rolled into the garage bay. But the delay had already thrown off the morning schedule. Every repair appointment that day ran behind by nearly half an hour. By the time I finished the alternator replacement on the delivery van, the afternoon sun was already hanging low over the rooftops. That evening, I sat at my workbench staring at the open repair manual in front of me without actually reading the page. The garage was quiet except for the ticking sound of cooling metal from the engines I had worked on all day. Something about the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Every time the homeowners association raised concerns about traffic, Linda's car happened to block the driveway again within a day or two. Every complaint seemed to line up perfectly with a fresh example she could point to. It was subtle enough that most people would not connect the pieces. But once I started looking closely, the timing felt too precise to be coincidence. I leaned back in the chair and looked out through the open garage door toward the empty stretch of gravel leading to the street. The driveway itself had not changed in years. Same width, same slope, same quiet entrance that had worked perfectly until recently. The only thing that had changed was the person who kept deciding to stand in the way of it. And as the evening air cooled and the streetlights flickered on one by one, a new thought settled in my mind with surprising clarity. If Linda Whitmore wanted to build a story about traffic problems, then sooner or later she was going to need proof. And the next time she parked that Mercedes across my driveway, I intended to be ready. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, long before the first delivery trucks started rolling through the neighborhood. The sky outside my kitchen window still carried that pale gray color that shows up right before sunrise, and the air had the cool, clean smell of overnight rain. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the table staring toward the driveway through the back door glass. For weeks I had been reacting to Linda Whitmore's behavior the same way most people react to inconvenience. I waited. I complained politely. I hoped it would stop. But the pattern from the past 2 months had made one thing clear. Waiting was exactly what she expected me to do. After finishing the coffee, I walked out to the garage and flipped on the lights. The overhead bulbs hummed softly, while the shop slowly filled with that familiar scent of metal and machine oil. Against the far wall sat a small shelf where I kept spare equipment and tools that did not belong in the main workspace. On the top of that shelf was a security camera kit I had bought months earlier for the garage interior. I picked up the box and turned it over in my hands for a moment. It had been sitting there unopened because I had never really needed it before. The neighborhood had always been quiet, but lately quiet did not mean peaceful anymore. By 7 o'clock the camera was mounted just under the edge of the garage roof facing straight down the driveway. From that angle, it could see the entire gravel entrance and a good portion of the street beyond it. I connected the small receiver inside the shop and watched the screen flicker to life. The picture was clear enough to show every detail, from the mailbox at the curb to the faint tire tracks running through the gravel. The system automatically stamped the time and date in the corner of the video. I stood there for a few seconds studying the image, listening to the distant sound of a lawn sprinkler somewhere down the block. Documentation. That word had started echoing in my mind ever since the HOA letter showed up. Stories can be twisted. Opinions can be argued. But clear evidence has a way of settling conversations very quickly. 2 days passed before the Mercedes appeared again. It was a bright Thursday morning, and I had just rolled open the garage doors when the familiar crunch of tires drifted across the yard. The white SUV turned slowly into position and stopped exactly where it always did, sideways across the driveway entrance like a gate closing. Linda stepped out holding her phone and began pacing casually along the sidewalk while talking to someone through her headset. The camera above the garage captured every second. The timestamp blinked steadily in the corner of the screen while the Mercedes sat there blocking the driveway for 23 minutes. When she finally drove away, I rewound the footage and watched the entire sequence again. The scene looked almost absurd. When played back without the usual frustration. A perfectly empty street. A wide open driveway. One expensive vehicle sitting directly across it with no reason to be there. That afternoon I drove into town and stopped by the municipal building where parking regulations were posted on a bulletin board near the entrance. The hallway smelled faintly like paper and floor polish, the kind of government building scent that never seems to change. I read through the posted ordinances slowly, paying attention to the sections about blocked access points and private driveways connected to permitted businesses. The wording was clear enough that even someone with a mechanic's background could understand it. A vehicle that blocks the entrance to a permitted driveway without authorization can be considered an obstruction under local traffic code. The rule had probably been written years earlier to deal with delivery trucks or careless parking. But reading that paragraph felt like finding a missing piece of a puzzle that had been sitting on my workbench for months. By the time I walked back to my truck, the late afternoon sun had turned the street outside into a strip of bright gold. I stood there for a moment holding the printed copy of the ordinance in my hand, while the traffic from Main Street rolled past. Linda Whitmore believed she was building a case against my garage one inconvenience at a time. What she did not realize was that every time she parked across my driveway, she was also creating a record that could work against her just as easily. And for the first time since this whole situation started, the balance of that story was beginning to shift. After reading that ordinance, I stopped treating the situation like a neighbor dispute and started thinking about it the way I approach a complicated engine problem. When a machine keeps failing, you do not hit it with a hammer and hope it fixes itself. You study the pattern, you find the weak point, and you let the design of the system solve the problem for you. Back at the garage, the late afternoon air smelled like warm gravel and sun-baked rubber. I printed 3 still images from the security camera footage and laid them across the workbench under the overhead light. Each one showed the same thing. The same white Mercedes sitting sideways across the driveway entrance. The same empty street around it. The timestamp glowing clearly in the corner like a silent witness. 23 minutes in one photo. 19 minutes in another. 31 minutes in the third. Looking at them side by side felt strangely satisfying. The way a mechanic feels when a scattered pile of bolts finally lines up with the diagram in a repair manual. Evidence has a quiet kind of order to it. That evening I called a local towing company that had a contract with several businesses in town. The owner, a guy named Robert Hale, had probably spent 30 years hauling broken-down cars off highways and parking lots. His voice carried the calm tone of someone who had seen every kind of roadside situation imaginable. I explained that my driveway connected directly to a permitted business garage and that it was being blocked repeatedly by a resident who did not seem to understand the access rules. Robert listened without interrupting while I described the layout of the driveway and the footage from the camera. When I finished, he let out a slow breath and said something that made the entire situation feel much simpler than it had before. He told me that if a vehicle blocks a business access point and the property owner requests removal, the law allows a licensed towing service to impound that vehicle under obstruction rules. No arguments about homeowners association opinions. No debates about neighborhood standards. Just a straightforward application of the same traffic code I had read earlier that afternoon. The key detail, he explained, was documentation. If the obstruction was recorded and the request came from the property owner, the towing company had clear authority to remove the vehicle. I thanked him and hung up the phone, then stood in the quiet garage listening to the faint ticking of the cooling engine from the last car I had repaired that day. Outside, the sky had shifted into that deep orange color that appears just before sunset. The driveway stretched out from the open garage doors toward the street, looking exactly the same as it had for years. The only difference now was that a small camera above the roofline quietly watched everything that happened there. Over the next few days, I continued working normally, fixing transmissions and replacing worn brake pads while the neighborhood carried on with its usual rhythm of lawn mowers and delivery vans. Linda Whitmore passed by the house twice during that time, each time giving the garage a brief look as if she was checking whether the place still existed. Her confidence had not changed. She still walked with that same steady stride that suggested the street belonged to her. But the following Monday morning, the sound I had been expecting finally returned. Tires crunching slowly across gravel. The familiar white Mercedes rolling into position across the entrance of my driveway, like it had dozens of times before. From inside the garage, I glanced up at the monitor mounted near the tool cabinet. The camera feed showed the SUV stopping exactly where it always did. The timestamp in the corner blinked quietly as Linda stepped out of the driver's seat and walked toward the sidewalk with her phone already raised to her ear. For a moment, I simply watched the screen, listening to the steady ticking of the clock on the wall behind me. Then I reached for my phone and dialed the number Robert Hale had given me 3 days earlier. Because sometimes the most effective solution to a problem is not loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is simply the moment when the system finally does exactly what it was designed to do. The call with the towing company lasted less than 30 seconds. Robert recognized my voice immediately and simply asked one question. He wanted to know if the vehicle was currently blocking the driveway. I looked up at the monitor mounted beside the tool cabinet. The screen showed the white Mercedes sitting exactly where it had stopped 10 minutes earlier, angled across the gravel like a temporary roadblock. Linda Whitmore was pacing slowly along the sidewalk with her phone pressed against her ear, completely relaxed, as if the entire street existed for her convenience. I told Robert the obstruction was still there. He said they would arrive shortly. Then the line clicked off. The garage suddenly felt very quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights above me and the distant chirping of birds somewhere beyond the houses. I walked over to the garage entrance and leaned casually against the door frame, watching the scene the same way someone might watch a slow-moving cloud across the sky. Linda had not even looked in my direction. In her mind, nothing had changed. She had parked there dozens of times before, and the outcome had always been the same. A short delay, a polite request. Then she drove away feeling completely justified. 15 minutes passed before the next sound arrived. The deep diesel rumble of a tow truck engine turning into the neighborhood street. It was not loud, but it carried a certain weight to it, like a machine built to solve very specific problems. The truck rolled slowly down the road until it reached the driveway entrance and came to a smooth stop behind the Mercedes. Robert stepped out wearing a dark work shirt and a reflective safety vest, clipboard in hand. He glanced briefly at me and gave a small nod that said everything had already been understood. Linda noticed the truck only after Robert walked toward her vehicle. Her conversation stopped mid-sentence, and she lowered the phone from her ear with a puzzled expression. From where I stood, I could hear her asking what he was doing. Robert pointed calmly toward the driveway and explained that the vehicle was obstructing access to a permitted business entrance and that he had received a request from the property owner to remove it. Linda's expression changed in stages that were almost fascinating to watch. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally the sharp irritation of someone realizing a situation was no longer under their control. She gestured toward the street and said she was only parked there temporarily. Robert listened patiently and then repeated the same explanation in the steady tone of a man who had delivered the same message hundreds of times. Temporary parking does not change the obstruction rule. During that conversation, the hydraulic arm on the tow truck lowered slowly behind the Mercedes. The metal equipment moved with a quiet mechanical precision that contrasted sharply with the rising tension in Linda's voice. Within moments, the front wheels of the SUV were lifted cleanly off the pavement. The scene remained strangely calm. No shouting, no crowd forming, just the steady operation of a machine performing its job exactly as designed. A few neighbors had begun to peek through their windows or step onto their porches, drawn by the unexpected presence of a tow truck on an otherwise quiet street. Linda stood beside the vehicle with her phone still in her hand, watching as Robert finished securing the straps and climbed back into the truck cab. The engine rumbled again, deeper this time, and the entire vehicle began to move slowly down the road. From the garage doorway, I watched the white Mercedes disappear around the corner of the block for the first time since this situation had begun. The driveway in front of me was suddenly empty again, a clear strip of gravel leading straight to the street like it had always been meant to be. And for the first time in weeks, there was nothing standing in the way of it. The street felt strangely quiet after the tow truck disappeared around the corner. For a moment, I simply stood there in the garage doorway, hands resting against the frame, watching the empty stretch of gravel that had been blocked so many times before. The morning sun had climbed higher while all of that unfolded, and the light now spread across the driveway in a long bright strip. It looked exactly the way it had looked when I first bought this house years ago. Clear, simple, functional. A few neighbors slowly stepped back from their porches and windows once the truck was gone. The normal sounds of the neighborhood returned almost immediately. A lawn mower starting 2 houses down. A dog barking somewhere behind the fence line. The ordinary rhythm of a quiet suburban street settling back into place like nothing unusual had happened at all. Inside the garage, my phone buzzed with a message from Robert confirming that the vehicle had been taken to the impound lot just outside town. The process from that point would follow the same routine used for any other obstruction removal. The owner could retrieve the vehicle after paying the towing fee and storage charges. It was not dramatic. It was simply procedure. I set the phone down on the workbench and went back to work. A silver sedan rolled into the driveway 10 minutes later for a scheduled transmission check. This time, there was nothing blocking the entrance, nothing forcing the driver to hesitate in the street or wonder if the shop was accessible. The car pulled straight into the garage bay like it was always supposed to. I guided the driver inside and lowered the lift while the steady scent of engine oil filled the air again. Work resumed exactly where it had been interrupted weeks earlier. Later that afternoon, I heard another vehicle stop at the curb outside the house. When I stepped out, I saw Linda Whitmore standing beside the empty space where her Mercedes had been that morning. She looked at the driveway for several seconds, then glanced toward the garage where the security camera sat quietly above the roofline. For once, she did not say anything. No speech about neighborhood standards. No confident explanation about traffic concerns. She simply turned and walked back toward her house with the same quick steps she usually used when heading to the clubhouse. The following days were noticeably calmer. No more sideways parking across the gravel entrance. No more sudden delays right before customers arrived. The driveway remained clear from morning until evening, exactly the way a driveway is supposed to function. A week later, another homeowners association meeting was scheduled at the clubhouse. I did not attend that one. I stayed in the garage, finishing a brake replacement while the sun set behind the row of houses across the street. The sound of my impact wrench echoed softly against the walls while the evening air cooled outside. Sometimes the most satisfying solutions are the quiet ones. No shouting arguments. No complicated revenge. Just a problem that finally meets the rule that was written to solve it. Standing there at the end of that day, looking out across the open driveway toward the quiet street beyond, I realized something simple that Linda Whitmore had apparently never considered. Power in a neighborhood does not come from who talks the loudest or who sits on a board meeting. It comes from understanding how the system actually works. And in the end, the same driveway that she tried to use as proof against my garage had quietly become the reason her car rolled away down that street instead.